Forensic Tales discusses topics that some listeners may find disturbing. The contents of this episode may not be suitable for everyone. Listener discretion is advised.
In 1986, a Washington woman was convicted of intentionally killing two people with cyanide-laced extra-strength Excedrin capsules. One of the victims was her very own husband. The other was a complete stranger. Her conviction and 90-year prison sentence became the first under federal product tampering laws, instituted after the 1982 Chicago Tylenol murders that killed at least 7 people. Is she a victim of a system that got it wrong during a time when people were paranoid of product tampering? Or is she guilty? This is Forensic Tales, episode 323, The Story of Stella Nickell. Welcome to Forensic Tales. I'm your host, Courtney Fretwell. Forensic Tales is a weekly true crime podcast with a forensic twist. Each episode features real stories highlighting how forensic science was used to uncover the truth. If you enjoy deep dives into real cases and the science behind them, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss an episode. And if you want even more content, including monthly bonus episodes, you can join our community over on Patreon. The support there truly helps keep this show going. To learn more, visit patreon.com/forensictales. And one small favor that makes a huge difference for the show. If you're enjoying the show, please consider leaving a positive review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Let's get into today's case. The 1980s were a time when a lot of people worried about product tampering. And can you really blame them? Everyone who lived during that time remembers the 1982 Chicago Tylenol murders, where at least 7 people were killed after taking cyanide-laced Tylenol pills. And since then, there have been several more deaths in subsequent copycat crimes. No one was ever charged in the poisonings, but a New York man was convicted of extortion for sending a letter to Tylenol's manufacturer, Johnson & Johnson, claiming responsibility and demanding $1 million. Even to this day, the 1982 Chicago Tylenol murders remain one of the most infamous unsolved murders in history. It's even a case we've covered on a very early episode of the show. But these product tampering murders in Chicago weren't the only ones from this same time period. About 2,000 miles away on the West Coast, 2 more people were killed in a very similar way. On June 5th, 1986, 52-year-old Bruce Nickell from Washington State came home from work complaining to his wife about a very bad headache. And like so many of us do when we have a headache, he immediately went to his medicine cabinet and reached for a bottle of extra-strength Excedrin capsules. He opened it and took out 4 pills. He then washed them down with a glass of water and stepped outside to get some fresh air and wait for the painkillers to kick in. But within minutes of swallowing them, he collapsed on the steps of his front porch while watching the birds. Bruce was taken to Harborview Medical Center in the First Hill neighborhood of Seattle. But there wasn't anything the emergency room doctors could do to save him. Within just minutes of arriving in the emergency room, Bruce was pronounced dead. He went from a seemingly healthy 52-year-old highway maintenance worker complaining of a headache to deceased. Initially, Seattle doctors thought Bruce had died from natural causes, even though he seemed perfectly healthy before June 5th, 1986, the attending doctors at Harborview Medical Center suspected he had died from emphysema. The reason they suspected emphysema was that he never had any other symptoms other than a headache. And in some rare cases, a person can die from complications of emphysema without having previously noticed any obvious symptoms. So doctors thought maybe that's what happened to him. But when another person died under very suspicious circumstances just days later, after taking a few over-the-counter pain pills, the police started to look at Bruce's death much differently. Just days after Bruce's sudden and mysterious death, 40-year-old bank manager Sue Snow died after taking 2 Excedrin pills on June 11th. Earlier that morning, around 6:30, Sue woke up and said good morning to her teenage daughter, Haley, like she did every day. After that, Haley went to take a shower to get ready for school, while Sue went to the main bathroom across the house to brush her teeth. But before brushing, she reached into her medicine cabinet and took 2 extra-strength pills because she woke up with a headache that morning. But when Sue never came out of the bathroom and Haley could still hear the water running, she went to go check on her mom. And that's when she found her unconscious and slumped over on the bathroom floor. 15-year-old Haley immediately ran to the phone to call for help. But just like in Bruce's case, paramedics and doctors were too late. Paramedics rushed Sue to Harborview Medical Center, the same exact hospital where Bruce had died just days earlier. But there was nothing anyone could do. Sue was pronounced dead later that morning after collapsing in her bathroom. Just like Bruce in Auburn, Sue had no known medical conditions. So for a 40-year-old woman to just suddenly collapse and die was practically unheard of. And the doctors who tried to save her life were just as confused, which is why an autopsy was requested. Sue's family and the doctors wanted to know exactly what happened and why she died. And when Assistant Medical Examiner Janet Miller examined the body, she knew right away something was wrong. Before she ever looked inside Sue's body, she picked up on something. She smelled the very distinct scent of bitter almonds, a clear sign of cyanide poisoning. So the medical examiner ordered a full toxicology report, and that's when everyone realized this was something far worse than a young mother simply dying one morning in her bathroom. The results of her toxicology revealed that she had died from acute cyanide poisoning. Arguably, one of the worst possible ways someone can die. Someone who's been poisoned with cyanide can start to feel the effects of the poison almost instantly. It essentially strips away the body's ability to use oxygen. So after someone ingests it, they might start to feel chest pain or tightness. They might also become dizzy, weak, or confused. Other people might start experiencing breathing problems, become short of breath, or even start wheezing. The effects of cyanide can take over a person within just a matter of a few minutes. And depending on how much is ingested, if the person doesn't get help right away, they can easily die. As soon as the local Seattle police got word about the cyanide, they went back to Sue's home to complete a thorough search. They needed to find out 2 things. Number 1, how Sue got such high levels of cyanide in her system. And number 2, who gave it to her. Was this some type of accidental poison exposure? Could it have been in her drinking water? Were others in the community at risk now? Or the most chilling possibility, had someone intentionally done this to her? While searching through Sue's bathroom, the same place where her daughter found her unconscious, the police found an open bottle of extra-strength Excedrin sitting on the counter. So the bottle was collected and sent for testing. And when the results came back, it confirmed all the detectives' suspicions. 3 of the remaining capsules in the 60-capsule bottle were found to be laced with cyanide in lethal quantities. This meant Sue hadn't just been exposed to a small amount of the poison. She had ingested a lethal amount by taking those 2 pills that morning for her headache. And almost instantly, the attention shifted to Sue's husband, Paul Webking. Almost every time someone is killed under suspicious circumstances, The police consider the victim's spouse as the first possible suspect. It's always the husband who kills the wife, right? We all know we're far more likely to be killed by someone we know rather than a complete stranger. And this case was no different. The police also had no idea about Bruce at this point, so all the focus was on Paul. And at the time, the police had every right to put him under a microscope. For one, he and Sue had only been married for about 7 months at the time of her murder. And number two, within just weeks of Sue's sudden and unexpected death, Paul reportedly had a new girlfriend in his life. So not only was he the husband and person closest to the victim, but he was also acting very strangely in the days and weeks after the murder. So the police kept a close eye on him and asked him to come down to the police station and take a polygraph. But as soon as the results came back, detectives had to take their foot off the gas. Paul Webking passed the polygraph. Yes, his behavior was a little strange, but was he a cold-blooded killer? Well, the polygraph seemed to eliminate him as a potential suspect. But if the husband didn't do it, then who did? After Sue's death, everyone's minds went straight to the 1982 Chicago Tylenol murders. And everyone's worst fear was that it was about to happen all over again, this time in Seattle. People really thought there was a copycat out there. So in response to the public panic, Excedrin's manufacturer, Bristol-Myers, decided to recall all the Excedrin products throughout the greater Seattle area. And on top of that, a group of other drug companies came together and offered a $300,000 reward for the capture of the person responsible for tampering with the pills. Everyone came together to make sure what happened in Chicago wouldn't happen in Seattle. But just when the authorities thought that Sue Snow's murder might turn cold, they got a very interesting phone call from someone they had never heard of. The caller was a woman named Stella Nickell, and she was Bruce's wife. And when she picked up the phone and called Seattle police, she said she had a theory for them. Stella said she had been watching the news when she heard about Sue Snow's death and how she had been poisoned with cyanide after taking a few Excedrin. She said her husband had recently died after taking a few pills from a bottle with the same lot number as the one that killed Sue. Up until this point, the police had no idea about Bruce or Stella Nickell. That's because everyone thought Bruce's death was from natural causes. No one had suspected he might have also been exposed to cyanide. After speaking with Stella, the police, alongside the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, examined Bruce's remains and 2 bottles that Stella had turned over to them. And when the tests came back, they were truly shocking. Both Bruce's remains and the 2 pill bottles tested positive for the presence of cyanide. That meant that Bruce hadn't died from natural causes as everyone had thought. That also meant the authorities were up to 2 victims. It was starting to look more and more like 1982 in Chicago. Initially, suspicion fell on Bristol-Myers, the company that manufactured the pills. And subsequently, both Paul Webking and Stella Nickell filed wrongful death lawsuits against the company. But pretty quickly, the company was cleared of any wrongdoing. As soon as the lawsuits were filed, the authorities went in and inspected the North Carolina facility where the tainted lot was packaged, but found no traces of cyanide. They couldn't find any explanation as to why it had been found in the Washington bottles. So if cyanide wasn't present at the manufacturing plant, then how did they get in those particular bottles? By June 18th, Bristol-Myers recalled all Excedrin products across the entire United States, pulling them from store shelves and warning consumers not to use any they had purchased. Then just 2 days later, the company took another step forward by recalling all non-prescription capsule products. People were really, really scared, and I think they had every right to be. Over the next week, local and federal law enforcement agents continued searching for additional contaminated bottles, and on June 24th, they found one. A cyanide-contaminated bottle was found at the same Albertsons grocery store where Sue had purchased her contaminated bottle. Then just 3 days later, on the 27th, the state of Washington effected a 90-day ban on the sale of non-prescription medication in capsules. For the next several weeks, the contaminated bottles from both Bruce and Sue's homes were extensively examined. And by this point, the Federal Bureau of Investigation had taken over the investigation from the local police in Seattle. Their goal was to find something within the bottles that could point them to a suspect. So they looked for things like fingerprints. And as soon as they did that, they got a much-needed break in the way of forensic evidence. Inside some of the contaminated bottles, the authorities found that in addition to the cyanide powder, there were also flecks of an unknown green substance. So the flecks were extracted from the bottles and tested separately. And that's when the Federal Bureau of Investigation's crime lab learned that the substance was actually an algaecide commonly used in home aquariums and fish tanks, sold under the brand name Algae Destroyer. At this point, both Sue's husband, Paul, and Stella Nickell were asked to take polygraphs. Since a search of the manufacturing plant yielded no trace of cyanide, the authorities wondered if someone close to the victims could have done it. I already talked about how Paul agreed to take a polygraph and passed. But Stella, on the other hand, initially refused to take one. In fact, a lawyer representing her told reporters at the time that she was, quote, too shaken up to be subjected to the test. But Stella's refusal to cooperate only heightened the police's suspicion of her. And they started to wonder, could she have been the one to tamper with the pills? She would eventually agree to the test, but the results didn't go in her favor. We'll talk more about that a little later on. Something Stella told police really stood out as strange. According to her, she had purchased the 2 bottles that she would eventually hand over to them at different stores at 2 different times. But this admission immediately stood out as a red flag, and here's why. A total of 5 cyanide-laced bottles had been found across the country. And it just so happened that Stella had purchased 2 of those bottles purely by chance. It's not like she said she bought the bottles together. She specifically said she purchased them from different stores on different days. To the police, that wasn't just a coincidence. That suggested something far more sinister. But there was one question on everyone's minds. If Stella had poisoned her own husband and a random stranger, then why would she call the police? Remember, she was the one who called in the tip after her husband Bruce suddenly passed away just days before Sue. She was also the one who voluntarily turned over the 2 contaminated bottles to the police to be tested. So if she was the one responsible, why would she essentially turn herself in? Well, according to the police, they think they know the answer to that question. And the answer involves money. The authorities say that Stella had taken out a total of about $75,000 in life insurance policies on Bruce. But it wasn't just the $75,000 she was after. Under her policy, if Bruce's death was accidental, she would get an additional $100,000. According to detectives, even before Sue's death, Stella had reportedly disputed doctors' conclusions that Bruce had died of natural causes. She wanted them to say that he had died in some type of accident. Because if his cause of death was accidental, she would stand to gain an additional $100,000. But if Bruce died of natural causes like initially suspected, she only got $75,000. The police would also later learn that Bruce's signature had been forged on at least 2 separate insurance policies, and they suspected it was Stella who had done it. But then came probably one of the biggest pieces of evidence against Stella, the algae destroyer. According to the police, she had purchased algae destroyer from a local fish store just days before Bruce was killed. And if you recall, from just a few minutes ago, specks of the green substance were found inside the contaminated pill bottles. So that's when the authorities came up with a theory. The substance became mixed with the cyanide when Stella used the same container to crush both substances without washing it between uses. When it came to motive, the police suspected it was mostly about the life insurance payout, but they also suspected it had something to do with the status of Bruce and Stella's marriage. Stella and Bruce got married in 1976, not long before those 7 people were killed in Chicago. But to fully understand the possible motive, we have to go back further than that. Stella Nickell was born in Colton, Oregon in August 1943, and her childhood was marked by poverty. Most of the time, her parents, Alva and George, barely had enough money to put food on the table each night. By the time Stella turned 16, she found herself pregnant with her first child, a daughter she named Cynthia Hamilton. Not long after she was born, Stella moved to Southern California with Cynthia's dad, who would later become her first husband. They also went on to have another daughter together. But life was never easy for Stella. She found herself deep in legal troubles multiple times, including a 1968 conviction for fraud, a 1969 charge of child abuse for beating her oldest daughter, Cynthia, with a curtain rod, and a 1971 conviction for forgery. She ended up serving 6 months in jail for the fraud charge and was ordered to participate in counseling after the child abuse charge. Stella and her first husband ended up getting divorced, and she met Bruce in 1974. When they met, Bruce worked as a heavy equipment operator and was described by many as a heavy drinker. In fact, most people who knew him described him as an alcoholic. But it's also fair to mention that Stella was also said to be a heavy drinker as well. And the heavy drinking is what led to the marital issues later on. By 1976, they were married. But during their decade-long marriage, things weren't always rainbows and butterflies. When Bruce was drinking, he had a very hard time keeping a job. And since he struggled to maintain a steady paycheck, the couple constantly struggled financially. But when he decided to hang up the bottle and stop drinking, things in the relationship took a different turn. Things between them began to sour. Stella wasn't ready to stop drinking, and she resented him for his choice to be sober. And every time she went out to the bars, he gave her a hard time about it. So that's when she reportedly requested night shifts at her security screener job at the Seattle-Tacoma International Airport and bought a home aquarium as a new hobby. About 6 months after Bruce and Sue's deaths, the police received another unexpected phone call. This time, it was from Stella's oldest daughter, Cynthia Hamilton. During this phone call, Cynthia told the FBI that her mom had spoken to her for years about wanting to murder Bruce. She said that her mom had grown bored with him after he stopped drinking. She even said her mom had gone down to the local library to look up poisons and ways to poison someone. And to verify what Cynthia was saying was true, the FBI went down to the Auburn Public Library, where Cynthia said Stella went, and discovered that Stella had borrowed, but never returned, a book called Human Poisoning. Her fingerprints were also still found all over other books about cyanide. About a year and a half later, on December 9th, 1987, Stella was indicted by a federal grand jury on 5 counts of product tampering, including 2 which resulted in the deaths of Bruce and Sue, and was arrested later that day. When it came to Bruce's death, the motive seemed pretty clear. It was all about the life insurance money. But what about Sue Snow, the innocent mom, wife, and bank manager who seemed to be caught in the middle? Well, according to prosecutors, Sue Snow was simply collateral damage. At Stella's trial in April 1988, prosecutors alleged that Stella had purchased all the contaminated Excedrin bottles herself, opened them, put cyanide in several capsules, then returned some of the bottles to store shelves in Seattle to make it look like a random killer. So when Sue bought that bottle, she had no idea that it had been tampered with. And when Stella left the bottles inside the grocery store, she had no idea who would purchase them. And according to prosecutors, she didn't care. All she cared about was wanting to kill her husband, Bruce, and collect on the life insurance money. She was angry that he had stopped drinking and was growing bored with the relationship, and she didn't care who else had to lose their life in the process. She knew that if Bruce was the only one killed, the finger would be pointed at her. So Sue Snow was simply a victim caught in the middle. Stella really wanted everyone to believe a copycat Chicago killer was out there. And since that green algae product was also found inside some of the bottles, they believe she likely crushed the cyanide using the same machine she used for her fish tank cleaner, the same aquarium she purchased right around the same time she started talking to her daughter about wanting to kill Bruce. Stella's lawyers argued that she had never purchased Algae Destroyer, but one of the prosecution's witnesses was the pet store manager, who testified that he remembered selling Stella the product. He said he remembered her because she purchased a large quantity of it. In fact, he didn't have the amount she wanted in stock, so he had to place a special order for it. In May of 1988, Stella was found guilty of all charges after 5 days of jury deliberations. But before the jury reached its decision, Stella's lawyers asked for a mistrial on the grounds of both jury misconduct and judicial misconduct. According to her attorneys, one juror had been a plaintiff in a case involving a pill baked into goldfish crackers. But the motion was denied, and on May 9th, Stella was sentenced to 2 terms of 90 years in federal prison for the 2 murders and 3 10-year terms for the product tampering charges. All the prison sentences were ordered to run concurrently, so Stella was essentially sentenced to 90 years in prison. As of November 2024, she's being housed at the Federal Correctional Institution, Hazleton in West Virginia. She's currently 82 years old and scheduled for release on March 7th, 2043. Although Stella Nickell has been in federal prison for almost 4 decades, she's almost never wavered about her innocence. Although we'll talk about a time where she might have confessed, but she says she never poisoned anyone or tampered with any bottles. She also claims that the forensic evidence used to convict her, mainly the discovery of the Algae Destroyer, isn't even credible. Here's her story. Stella says that the pet store manager who said she bought the green substance only wanted to collect some of the reward money. If you recall from earlier in the episode, a $300,000 reward was offered for any information leading to an arrest. Well, according to Stella, the fish store manager collected some of that money. He reportedly received around $15,000 for his testimony. And he wasn't the only one who received money for their testimony. Remember Stella's oldest daughter, Cynthia? She also received a large part of that reward money for her cooperation with the FBI. According to reports, she received well over $200,000 for her cooperation. So that's the question to ask yourself. Did these people lie simply to collect the reward money? Or were they simply being rewarded for their contributions in catching a killer? If you ask Stella, she'll say all these people lied, including her own daughter. For a very long time, she maintained that she never told her about plans or desires to kill Bruce. And she also claims she never bought the Algae Destroyer from the pet store. And without proof of the algae, she claims there isn't any solid forensic evidence linking her to the murders. She says the forensic evidence points to another person as the killer. As for her fingerprints on the cyanide library books, she claims she was looking up information about poisons that could be ruining her garden. In 2001, her attorneys filed a second appeal based on evidence obtained by 2 private investigators who had spent months looking into the case. They alleged that the FBI intentionally withheld documents from the defense at her original trial. They also claimed that Stella was told that she failed her polygraph, but her lawyers were never shown the actual results. But the appeal was ultimately denied. Since then, has she had a change of heart about her innocence? As recently as 2022, Stella filed a petition for compassionate release in which she no longer maintained her innocence. Before then, she had been previously denied in 2017. Whether or not she ever fully accepts responsibility, there are still 2 innocent victims in this story. 2 people who had their lives stolen after taking cyanide-laced over-the-counter pain pills. They turned to the drugs to make themselves feel better. But it was those same drugs that ultimately killed them. The person responsible for tampering with the pills thought she could get away with it. She thought she was smarter than the forensic evidence. But in the end, all the forensic evidence led police back to her. 2 out of the 5 contaminated bottles were purchased by her. To the police, that was no coincidence. Her fingerprints were all over the library book about cyanide poisoning. And it was her fish tank cleaner that was found inside the tampered bottles. All the forensic evidence led back to her. Forensic Tales is a Rockefeller audio production. The show is written and produced by me, Courtney Fretwell. If you'd like to support the show and help fund research, production, and editing, you can do so with a small monthly contribution on Patreon. Patreon supporters get early access to ad-free episodes and exclusive bonus content. Thank you so much to this week's newest supporter, Joanne. You can learn more at patreon.com/Forensic Tales. You can also watch Forensic Tales on YouTube. Just search Forensic Tales Podcast and be sure to subscribe. And if you enjoy the show, leaving a positive rating or review really helps others discover it. For a full list of sources used in this episode, visit forensictales.com. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next week. Until then, remember, not all stories have happy endings.